So when you're labeling your pieces, something that we see is that people will say cut two instead of cut one pair. Now, if your instruction on the pattern piece is to say to cut two, what cut two means is that you cut one here with the right side up, and then you move it across and you cut another one with the right side up. But that would mean that this sleeve is actually the sleeve for you've got two right side sleeves then, rather than having one right side and one left side. So it says on here it's a sleeve cut one pair. So cut one pair is when we cut it this way and then we flip it over and then we cut it that way again. And you can see that's why it has a grain line on the back here, so we can see the grain line on both of the pieces and we flip it over. If you've got the fabric folded, then that automatically happens, that you cut a pair. But remember that in production, when you lay up the fabric isn't laid up on the fold, as I mentioned before. It's actually laid up flat like this, and that's why it's important to get your head into saying, cut one pair and having that written on your piece rather than just cut two. With the back here, this piece here, because we've got a whole back panel piece, this one actually says just cut one, as opposed to cut one on the fold like we did before. So if the fabric was folded in half, we had a fold here, we would put that there, and this piece here we'd probably have to have a play with that to see what would fit in there, because this fabric is narrower than the calico. So that's the other reason why too, that if you're cutting production, you have the whole pattern piece out flat, because then you can automatically see what's left over and decide what's going to happen there. So what would probably happen in this instance is that you'd have your other front there because it's the next biggest piece, and then you'd have this spare here. So you'd probably put your cuff in there so that the elephants are going around the cuff. So you'd have 1 and 2. And the reason this says cut one pair on here, which is fine, but you could actually say cut two on this piece because it's just a rectangle. So either that way or that way, it's the same, it doesn't matter. Whereas with the front piece here, this is cut one pair because you need one piece for the left hand side, and then you need that piece flipped over, and it would probably fit in there somewhere for the right hand side. Okay, so the other pieces are probably fine. So the collar stand, the collar, the yoke are all cut. They would be cut too, but it's just a really good habit to get into the habit of cutting one pair, even if a cut two cutting instruction is still correct.
What other information do they need to put on their pattern?
Sure, good question, Libby. So what you need to put on your pattern piece, this one here, we actually have a name of the style, which is the classic lady shirt. We have size 10, the fact that it's the sleeve, and that we're cutting one pair of the sleeve. What you'd also need on your pattern pieces, you don't have to give the style a name, but that's sometimes a really good thing to do. It could also be, rather than having the name of the style, you might have the name of the season, and then give the pattern piece a code number that would then refer back to that sample, as part of a bigger collection. But most importantly, you need your name on the pattern piece. Your name on the pattern piece is more important than the name of the style, because there are so many random pattern pieces that we find around the studio that have no name on them. And if it has your name on it, we can put it into your box. If it doesn't have your name on it, it's more likely going to just get thrown away. So more than anything, your name is important. The other thing you could do too, if you're going through quite a long toiling process or sampling process, is that you may want to put the date on your piece so you know which is the newest piece that you've been working on, because it's quite easy to sometimes just add to the pile as you go along. So you've got your original master pattern, you've got copy of pattern 1, pattern 2, and it just turns into this big pile. So, when you start and you create a new pattern, put the date on it so that then, a bit later on you can potentially get rid of, the first iteration of that pattern.
And what are all these other things? So that line, that long line, that's obviously the grain line. So that should be on every pattern piece, shouldn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So the grain line on here, so this is the center, and like I said before, because you might need to flip the piece over, it's on the wrong side of the piece as well. Like I was saying before, with a print like this one here, this is a one-way print. So what you might do is you might have the arrow going down towards the cuff, so that you know that the elephants, when you cut it out, the elephants are going to be walking upright. The same with the piece here. This one actually, this back yoke piece has a grain line that follows the centre back. Generally, a grain line the grain line on the yoke would go this way, parallel to this straight edge. But if we did that, that means that the elephants would be walking, up and down the yoke instead of walking backwards and forwards. So in this instance, it's really important for you to have the centre back grain this way. And we actually talked before about the collar pieces as well. So the collar points here, like on a shirt, the collar points go down, so they have to go that way. So the elephants, when this is on the body, the elephants are walking around the collar, not upside down. And then again with your collar stand here. So so again the elephants are walking around the collar. So your grain line would be the centre back grain line on these three pieces, potentially with arrows showing that the bottom of the pattern or the lower part of the pattern goes that way.
And those notches on there, you can see on the yoke there's some notches where the head of the sleeve is going to match up on the shoulder there.
Yeah, exactly. Because this is our original shoulder line here, and we've actually designed a line that comes forward on the shoulder. So when you sew the sleeve into the garment, the notch, the head of the sleeve actually matches that notch there. It doesn't line up with the seam allowance on the front of the yoke. It goes there. So that's why this is probably the most important notch on your yoke, the one on the shoulder there, because the thing is, even if you do forget to clip the notch at the centre back of the neckline and the centre back of the yoke, the lower yoke, you could do that as you were sewing anyway. You'd be able to fold the piece in half and then just clip both of those to give you those 2 points. But it can sometimes be a bit harder to do that on a sleeve head, especially if the sleeve is a different shape front and back. And sometimes you might know how far you've brought that seam allowance forward there. That looks like 2.5 centimetres, which means that it's 2.5 centimetres from the stitch line of the front yoke there to that point. But yeah, you have to be,
Yeah, and that all takes time, doesn't it? It's just so much easier to make sure you put your notches when you cut out, and clip them into the where the notch is.
Exactly.
It just makes sewing so much easier. You save so much time. You get such a better finish if you do have notches.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think that's all. Oh, there's darts as well, which you'd be marking. It's much easier to be marking things like where your darts and drill holes, which are used in production. It's much easier to be marking that as you're cutting off, rather than looking for where they are as you're sewing it and then having to go back and mark them.
Exactly. And you'll see here that this point here is actually the stitched end of the dart. So the stitching, when you're sewing the dart, finishes there, but the drill hole to indicate the end of the dart is actually 1 centimetre back from where that stitch line finishes. And that's so when you poke, because you're literally poking a hole through the fabric, and in production sometimes that hole can be 2 millimeters big, like 2 millimeters across, so it's a big hole. And so that's why when you sew past that hole, so that the hole is actually disguised by, it's covered up by the stitching that you're creating at the end of the dart there. Same at the top end here. And then in the middle, now this is a bit odd that there are three there are three drill holes here. What I would probably do is just have the one in the middle, knowing that I wanted to sew a centimetre past on each one.
And I think that's what's happened there. We've started out with placing the drill holes 5 or 6 millimetres in from the edge of the stitch line, but then we've realised it's simpler to just have one in the middle.
And neither of them is wrong. Like this, having these two here is fine. It just means that you're drilling an extra hole, and there's something else to keep track of.
And Mark, when this is drill holes are really a production thing. So if you're laying up 10 pieces of fabric, you're cutting out 10 garments all at one time, you can just put your awl through and quickly mark where all of those dart positions are on all 10 pieces of lay of fabric. But if they're just cutting out one, do they need to put a hole into the fabric, or can they just mark it some other way?
You could mark it with chalk or with a pin. Sometimes, depending on the fabric, you can't actually drill a hole in the fabric for whatever reason. If it's a really loose weave, so you could put a thread there to show where that drill hole is going to be. Or you could mark it with chalk. What I usually do if I'm marking it with chalk is I'd actually rub the chalk over the hole there, making sure there is actually a hole and the chalk is going through the hole. And then I would lift it up, I'd see where the chalk spot would be, and then I'd just mark a big cross, and using that dot as the centre, so it's a really obvious mark that I've got to go by, and then do the same at the top and the same at the bottom.
I often just put a pin through, so I'll put a pin through where the actual dart end is, and just sort of lift the pattern piece up and sort of chalk it underneath.
Exactly. So the pin goes in through the hole, you lift it up. The pin, you just lift it up a little bit so you don't pull the pin out completely. Just rub your chalk right on top of the end of the pin that's sticking into the fabric. And then you can pull it up, and then you can turn it into a big notch.
So you can have your own system with that. But
the other thing too to keep in mind is that if you are marking drill holes with chalk, when you've got them marked on the fabric, you're not actually sewing on the right side of the fabric when you're doing darts. So even if you've got a cross there marked with chalk, you're probably still going to have to stick a pin into it and have a look on the other side where that dart is, the dart drill hole is, so because you're going to sew it on the inside of the garment, not on the outside. But really, the pattern, all of the information for the construction of your garment should somehow be shown on your pattern piece, so that you've always got it as a reference to go back to. One last thing I'll say here too is you can see on these pieces, even though these are in cardboard, and this pattern is a block of a style of shirt, so it has all of the different pieces. Generally, our blocks don't have. Our women's blocks in particular don't have grain lines on them. Don't have seam allowances on them. This one actually has seam allowances marked on it, and you can see where the stitch line has been drawn onto the pattern piece. And this is something that I always do with my patterns. I always draw the stitch line on there so that I know how big my seam allowance is, and and how the seam allowances change as well. These don't have them marked on the collar piece, but you would see if they did that the stitch line around your collar pieces and your neckline would be 6 mil, so you can automatically just look at the pattern and know how much of a seam allowance there is. It takes a little bit of time and a bit of getting used to using the grading ruler to mark seam allowances, but I think it's just an extra thing that makes it just that much easier for you to use the patterns.
And so Mark, when would you use a 6 millimetre seam allowance instead of a centimetre, which is fairly common on pattern pieces?
Generally, you'll find if you've used commercial patterns that all of the seam allowances on commercial patterns are 1.5 centimetres. And what they say is to sew it at 1.5 and then trim it back to 6 mil. And I have to say it's pretty much impossible to do a nice neckline sewing a collar onto a neckline if you've got a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. So the 0.6 seam allowances that we have, or that we suggest you have on your collar pieces and your neckline pieces, are just so that it's easier to sew, and generally you don't actually have to clip in around those curves as well to get things to sit correctly.
This neckline's quite tight, isn't it? It's quite a tight little curve. So
It is, yeah,
difficult
exactly.
to have a big
Yeah,
thing
and the
like
measurements have to be particularly precise. The most accurate measurements you have are those measurements that you have around your neckline and on your collar pieces. And that this is just a shirt pattern, but that goes particularly for a tailored collar pattern on a jacket as well. But generally, the smaller the seam allowances are, and keep in mind too that maybe if the fabric you're using tends to fray quite a lot, you might want to put a fusing support around the neckline to give it a bit of extra body if you're going to sew it at 0.6, or maybe you'll sew it at 1 centimetre and then trim it back to 0.6 so that you've got, so the fabric doesn't fray away before you even get around to sewing it.